Saat Farkı'ndan merhabalar. Her hafta farklı ülkelerden, farklı milletlerden konuklarla bölgesel ve küresel gelişmelere, meselelere dair farklı perspektiflere yer vermeye çalışıyoruz. Bu hafta Afrika'ya uzanacağız. Somali'den çok kıymetli bir konuğum var. Bir konferans için İstanbul'daydı kendisi. Somali Kalkınma ve Uluslararası İşbirliği eski bakanı Abdi Aynte stüdyomuzda. Bu hafta Somali'yi, ülkede geçtiğimiz aylarda yapılan seçimler sonrası siyasi atmosferi, artan terör saldırılarını ve yeni dönemde terörle mücadele gibi başlıkları konuşacağız. Welcome, Mr. Aynte. Welcome to Istanbul and welcome to my show. Thank you very much for taking time.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Well, we will start with domestic Somali politics first. You recently held elections back in May. Former leader Hassan Sheikh Mahmoud returned to power after 5 years. Indeed, he made history as the first person to be elected twice as president, so he got a second chance. So I want to ask you, what brought him back? Could you tell us more about the country's political landscape before and after the elections?
First of all, thank you for having me on your show. I mean, I would say a primary reason why President Hassan Sheikh was re-elected is because in the intervening 5 years, we've had far more political instability than we've had in the decade before. And so people needed a sense of political stability, which President Hassan Sheikh provided in his first term, and he's expected to provide that in the second term. And political stability for a country like Somalia is very critical when you're having other problems, security problems, economic problems, humanitarian crises, and so on and so forth. Former president, for my job, essentially created so much political domestic instability, so much political crisis around the country, and that's why people wanted a return to someone they know. It's more like a steady hand that you needed in times of huge political instability.
So he's definitely more experienced now, and he's probably going to deal with the issues better this way. What are the expectations in general? Then I will come to the security challenges you mentioned in depth.
Yeah, and of course, I mean, certainly he's expected to be a lot more experienced, both as a president, but also as a leader of a country that is struggling and recovering from 30 years of instability and conflict and so on and so forth. Also, President Hassan Sheikh has learned on both sides, being as a president, but then also being as an opposition leader for 5 years. I think that gives you a unique perspective that many people don't get around the world. I think only very few people around the world get the chance of being re-elected, but also re-elected on a second term, not consecutively. I think President Lula of Brazil was just recently re-elected again. So I think it's a unique perspective that many people don't actually, an opportunity that many people don't receive.
Right. So, Mr. Aynte, the biggest challenge is surely Al-Shabaab, which has intensified its attacks and regained territories controlled by the government in recent years. Can you give us, first of all, some more background on Al-Shabaab first? And then, this time the president seems to be very tough, very determined. He declared a total war against Al-Shabaab. So what basically went wrong in the previous government? Why this kind of fight against Al-Shabaab failed? What is the difference? What is different this time, and what is the strategy? Does he have a new strategy or something? So let's start with the more background on the group first, on the insurgency group first, and then come to my second question, please.
Yes. So Al-Shabaab is a militant group that was established about 13 years ago, back in 2008. They are or continue to be a branch of Al-Qaeda, global Al-Qaeda network. In fact, right now they are assessed to be the strongest Al-Qaeda branch in the world that has survived for that many years. Their core ideology is based on a very extreme ideology, which is to say that even though the 100% of the Somali people are Muslim, they believe that many of them are not Muslims because they're not adhering to their extremist ideology. And they claim to be bringing or wanting to bring about a Sharia-based country, a legal framework that's based on Sharia. And keep in mind that our constitution, in fact, is based on the Sharia. There is no article in our constitution that contradicts the Sharia, for example. So at the end of the day, they are a militant group, and their focus is really to try to create a state that's haven for global terrorists. And the other thing to know about Al-Shabaab is that they're not only a Somali entity, even though they were based in Somalia, established in Somalia, they've waged attack all across the world, specifically in our region, in Kenya, Ethiopia, Djibouti, even Uganda, and other countries. And they're exporting this terrorism ideology. To the second question of, President Hassan Sheikh has now revamped, military operation against Al-Shabaab. I think the president is reflecting, I would say, the feeling of the vast majority of the Somali people who have been under the thumb of Al-Shabaab for a decade now and are really wanting to liberate themselves from Al-Shabaab. Because Al-Shabaab has now become a huge headache for the vast majority of the Somali people. They are extorting millions of dollars, probably about $400 or $500 million a year from the Somali people, who are very poor people, farmers and people who are camel herders and so on and so forth. And secondly, they're not providing any stability or services in exchange for this money that they're collecting. And so President Hassan Sheikh essentially is now waging this counter-terrorism offensive against Al-Shabaab because Al-Shabaab has been there for too long. The previous government has actually not carried out any tangible attack against Al-Shabaab whatsoever. They focus it on their political opponents rather than the security operation in the country.
So there's a new strategy this time, including political negotiation or solely dependent on the military fight, basically?
The government has left the door open for political negotiations, but that's not the starting point. I think the government understands that what they need first is to degrade, I would say significantly degrade the capabilities of Al-Shabaab, put them in a considerably weaker position than they are currently, and then open the door for negotiations for people who are willing to renounce violence and embrace the constitutional process of the country. Now, I have to tell you that there are not many leaders within the Al-Shabaab ranks today who are willing to do that. I mean, in the past, there were some leaders, including one current minister, was actually a former co-founder of Al-Shabaab. But he renounced violence, rejoined the constitutional order, and he's now one of the lead voices against Al-Shabaab operations.
I see. Mr. Aynte, I also want to ask you that, the Taliban's takeover of Afghanistan has raised some concerns that it could encourage other Islamist militant groups around the world, such as Al-Shabaab. Some analysts say Somali could see a similar development unless the Somalian government ends its over-dependence on international troops. So I also want to ask international partners' role here also in the conflict zones because their focus is mainly on destroying the militant group itself, in this case destroying Al-Shabaab itself, not really like developing a strong state. And this was the case, I think, that was very obvious in Afghanistan after the pullover especially. So what are the lessons to be learned, and do you have the same concern that this might encourage also Al-Shabaab to take control of the country?
I would say that Al-Shabaab does not have the same infrastructure that Taliban did in Afghanistan. Keep in mind that Taliban remained for 20 years as a national movement. Al-Shabaab was never a national movement. They were a transnational terrorist organization connected to a global terrorist ideology. That's one thing. The second thing to keep in mind is that, in fact, in the last 4 months, this huge war against Al-Shabaab is largely waged by Somali forces, both formal forces but also informal community resistance forces. And so this is actually, we are now proving to the rest of the world and to ourselves that, in fact, there is no such thing as dependence on foreign forces. It is true that the African Union peacekeeping mission has been in Somalia for over 15 years now, and there was some dependence on them. But I think under President Hassan Sheikh, we're now seeing a fundamentally different approach in that this entire war is being waged without African Union peacekeepers. And people are now seeing that it is in fact possible to defeat Al-Shabaab, to degrade them without African Union peacekeeping mission. In fact, this war has been far more impactful than other operations that came with the help of African Union peacekeeping mission. Now, of course, this is not to say that the African Union peacekeeping mission has been a total failure. I would not say that. I think they've been very helpful for the better part of the past 15 years. But I think most people believe that they have overstayed. And as you said, it's now time to reflect on that moment and ensure that Somali security forces are able to recapture their own territories.
Speaking of the foreign forces, Mr. Aynte, the U.S. Has decided to keep a military presence in Somalia. President Biden redeployed U.S. troops, reversing Donald Trump's earlier withdrawal. So what does U.S. re-entry into Somalia mean for the Horn of Africa and for bigger powers in general? So what role does the U.S. also play here in the conflict, in the fight against Al-Shabaab here?
The United States is the largest supporter of Somalia, both in military, financial, and in humanitarian terms. So in other words, it is in fact the most indispensable ally that Somalia has today. Now, the security support and assistance that comes from the U.S. to Somalia has been there now for over a decade, and most of it comes in the form of support to counterterrorism efforts. For example, the U.S. trains the most elite forces that Somalia has. It's called the Danab Force. They are the ones who are actually currently leading this war against Al-Shabaab. And now, the decision by Donald Trump in his waning days to withdraw I think there were about 900 or so U.S. troops in Somalia was not a strategic decision. It was like many other decisions that were made by Donald Trump, very reactive, very emotional, and really designed to appeal to a domestic U.S. audience rather than a calculated strategic international decision. I think President Biden did the right thing by restoring that, because the security support component that the U.S. provides to the Somali government, as I said, is vital. It is, in fact, I would say, one of the most important security packages that any country provides. Now, of course, Turkey is another
yes, we will also
big
talk about Turkey.
Yes.
But can you count on U.S. presence or U.S. itself after especially what we have seen in Afghanistan?
Look, the U.S. presence in Somalia is very, very small. We're talking about maybe 400 to 500 forces that are in different strategic locations around the country. The most important one is an Air Force field in the south of the country, and what they do there mainly is to provide training, as I said, to the most elite defense unit we have. That's most of their work. They also have they provide some air support to our security operations, essentially bombing Al-Shabaab locations with their drones and so on. So I would say it's not a significant support, so to speak, but it's small and impactful in the way it is right now.
Mr. Aynte, what about China? I also want to ask you, because there is a growing Chinese influence in Africa in general. China's first overseas military base is located just right next to you in Djibouti, in the Horn of Africa. So how does this U.S.-China competition, let me ask you this way, reflect on or have an impact on the region, in your region? How do you feel that competition in your region?
So big power competition is obviously not a new thing around the world, and certainly not new in our region, in the Horn of Africa. I think it has taken a new dimension in the last decade, in that the U.S. continues to be the provider of strategic security support to most countries in the region, Somalia, Ethiopia, Kenya, and so on and so forth. And China happens to be a big partner in terms of economic development, and that's very critical, as you know. So when you look at Ethiopia and Kenya, for example, their transport and other sectors investment is largely coming from China, not for free, obviously. This is, we are all very familiar with the Chinese economic development packages. It comes in the form of loans, bilateral loans. And so that's that. Now, in the case of Djibouti, that's very unique in that China, I think, opened its first military base, overseas base in Djibouti, right opposite of the American military base, by the way, in Djibouti. But many other countries have military bases in Djibouti. It's a small country that certainly has many allies and supporters around the world. In the context of Somalia, China remains our largest trading partner, for example. Right now, the largest trading happens between Somalia and China. And that's a fact of life. But China cannot match, at least for now, the diplomatic, I would say, the robust diplomatic presence and engagement that the U.S. has in Somalia, which has been there for decades. Certainly has been there for the last 2 decades in a meaningful way. And I don't anticipate Chinese sort of military intervention in Somalia anytime soon.
I see. Okay, Mr. Aynte, we have only 5 minutes left, so I also want to talk about Turkey-Somali relations as well, because the two have a long-standing relations, as you know. So Somalia has an important place in Turkey's overall Africa policy and Africa opening, if we can use that term. So Turkey opened the biggest overseas military base in Somalia, and thousands of Somali soldiers have been trained there. So how do you see Turkey's contributions in the fields of security and medical business? So how do you see Turkey's role in general in Somalia, also in the Horn of Africa?
Well, let's start with Somalia. I think since President Erdogan came to Somalia for the first time in 2011 during that famine, when he was a prime minister, the relationship between the two countries has taken a dramatic turn, I would say. One that I think none of the two countries expected, in the way it had grown quite exponentially. Today, Turkey is the fastest growing trading partner, for example, with Somalia. I believe in the next 5 years, it'll be the second largest partner or something like that. In terms of support, Turkey provides significant military support. You mentioned the big military base there, but also Turkey has its largest embassy anywhere in the world, in Somalia as well. 1/3 of our entire security forces is trained by Turkey in Somalia, but also here in Turkey, where a lot of the senior security officers are brought. So I would say this is a very strategic relationship, one that's based on mutual interest. Certainly, a lot of Turkish businesses and companies are profiting from this relationship, and a lot of Somali businesses are increasingly entering the Turkish market and trying to export and import a lot of stuff. Turkey also views Somalia as a gateway to the rest of the region. The relationship with the rest of the region with Turkey is not as vibrant as it is with the one with Somalia, but in economic terms, it's much larger. I mean, Turkey has about $4 billion investment in Ethiopia, probably a couple $2 billion in Kenya, and so on. The investment in Somalia is still relatively small, but I would say a lot more strategic and impactful than those countries. So I anticipate this relationship to grow and flourish over the coming decade or so.
So under the new presidency, do you expect the relations will continue to grow, or what are the challenges?
In fact, I would say it has grown under Hassan Sheikh. When he was president first time, that's when the most significant Turkish investments actually in Somalia did happen. The Turkish relationship with Somalia has nothing to do with who is the president at that point in time. It's very bipartisan. Everyone in Somalia really respects Turkey as one of our most important and most admired partners.
Mr. Aynte, I saw in a report that Istanbul became one of the most popular names for girls in Somalia. Is it true?
It is true. That was many years ago, but I think that continues. But the important thing, what that signifies, is that a lot of Somalis, both from Somalia, but also we have about 2 million people in the diaspora, come here for holiday, for medical treatment, for investment, and for a number of other reasons. I mean, Istanbul is now becoming, I would say, a de facto global capital for Somalis around the world. So I think this relationship between the two countries will improve, will certainly in the economic sense, I think that will be beneficial for both sides, because at the moment, of course, it's lopsided. It's mainly Turkish companies providing and importing a lot into Somalia, but I think we anticipate that also there will be a reciprocity from the Somalia side as well.
Okay, there are lots of other issues that I want to talk about. Unfortunately, time is over. Thank you very much for coming here, Mr. Aynte. Hope to see you next time.
Thank you for having me, Feyza.
Thank you very much. Evet, Saat Farkı'nı bu haftada böylelikle noktalamış olduk. Somali'den eski bir bakan ağırladık. Uluslararası İşbirliği ve Kalkınma eski bakanı Abdi Aynte bizlerleydi. Somali'yi konuştuk, Afrika'ya uzandık. Terör başta olmak üzere kıtayı ve ülkeyi, Somali'yi ilgilendiren önemli meseleleri, sorunları konuştuk. Önümüzdeki hafta yine farklı bir konuyla, farklı bir konukla karşınızda olmak dileğiyle. Hoşça kalın.